First, we have Todd Foley. Todd, wave to everybody. Todd is the Senior Vice President of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Council on Renewable Energy, also called ACORE, A-C-O-R-E. Todd leads the strategic integration of policy development, research, external communications, and interaction with federal and state government and regulatory officials. He has over 25 years experience in federal and state policy. We'll be talking a lot about that during the course of our panel. Renewable energy, market design, business development, and sales. He also has served in several U.S. government positions, including the White House, Senate, EPA, and Occupational Safety and Health Administration. And then Todd holds a bachelor's degree from Boston College and a law degree from Washington College of Law at American University. So Todd, thank you for being here. Ed Smeloff. Ed, wave to the group. Okay, figured that would be Ed, given the choices we had left. Ed is the director of grid integration for Vote Solar. He's on Vote Solar's regulatory team working to transform the electric power system to be cleaner, smarter, and more durable by integrating solar power and other clean energy technologies at all scales, from rooftop to the utility scale power plant. And Vote Solar is involved in regulatory activities in 12 of the states. Ed has a BA from UC Davis and a Master's of Public Administration from USC. Fight on that. So thank you for that. And then Bambi Tran, I've known Bambi for a long time. Bambi is the Executive Director for Grid Alternatives, and in her capacity, she directs the Inland Empire office at Grid, which is, I think most of you know, a 501c3 community nonprofit organization that intends to make renewable energy technology and job training accessible to underserved communities. And she's got 20 years of experience in green building education, community development, and nonprofit. She has a BS in architecture from the University of Virginia and a master's in real estate development from the University of Maryland College Park. So we appreciate having all three of the panelists here, and so we're going to try to run through. We're not doing PowerPoint presentations. We decided as a group to just go straight into some Q&A, and hopefully we'll have some time for you also to ask some questions if things come to you. So we have a real good group to talk about barriers and opportunities for the expansion of solar in an area that not only sorely needs it, but obviously with our climate and characteristics and open space can certainly accommodate something to become a leader in this field in the nation. So kind of start with some background. I'll direct the first question to Ed. Ed, of course, I think most of you know that the California legislature has passed SB 100. That puts California on a path to 100% zero emission or zero carbon electricity by 2045. So can you maybe give us a little bit more background regarding what SB 100 does and how that might impact citizens and businesses in inland Southern California?
So the passage last year of SB 100 was a landmark for California. It's part of an evolution where we've decided we are capable of increasing the amount of renewable energy that we can integrate onto the grid here in California. It's actually been taken up elsewhere in other states, other governors. Some of the recently elected governors throughout the West in New Mexico, Colorado, and Nevada have been inspired by that and are pushing their utility commissions and utilities to also up the ante in terms of the amount of renewables on the system. We've heard that the cost curve has come down. Wind, solar, geothermal are quite affordable now, competitive with conventional technologies. But the challenge is going to be the actual integration of those systems so that we maintain reliability while adding more and more variable resources onto the grid. So part of what SB 100 does is sets a framework for the various regulatory authorities, the Energy Commission, the Air Resources Board, the Public Utilities Commission, to begin to study and present reports on those issues periodically so that we have a better understanding of how we're going to get to 100% carbon-free electricity. We need to have a system that is much more flexible. You've heard about the duck curve. Well, the duck The duct sits on a pond of inflexibility, perhaps 15,000 megawatts of inflexible generation. So we need to, over time, drain down the inflexible pond so that we begin to have more headroom for using renewable energy to meet those requirements. 60% of the state's requirement is going to be renewable by 2030 with interim steps there. So we have some things that are already happening. Diablo Canyon is going to be closed. That's one of the inflexible resources by 24 and 25. Combined heat and power systems will perhaps renegotiate the way that they're operated and their contracts under purpose so that we reduce and use combined heat and power in a more effective way to meet the thermal loads, but create headroom for solar. And we need to retire a significant amount of the inflexible portion of the fossil fuel generation in California while retaining that part of the fleet that has the capability of quick starting and stopping and fast ramping capabilities so that we can meet the challenges of the evening peak. You know, as we get to 100% renewables, it's going to also have major require fundamental changes to the way we operate the hydroelectric system and to the cost of running a system of natural gas pipelines in the state. We're going to diminish the amount of natural gas that we're using, but there is still our core customers that require natural gas for heating and water heating, et cetera. Although, as we heard from Southern California Edison, there's going to be a major initiative, and from the Energy Commission, major initiative to move away from using natural gas for those purposes to using electricity. It's going to be an important part of sort of the strategy of creating equity and protecting customers who are currently using natural gas. And also we need to think through, you know, how do we use the hydroelectric systems both in California and the Pacific Northwest to provide more flexibility and to help meet the ramping services. So those are issues that are going to be studied as part of the SB 100 process. I do want to talk a little bit more about flexibility. Maybe we could go to that a little bit later, but there's a lot of things that need to happen on both the demand and supply side to have a grid that is much more flexible. Batteries are one part of the solution, demand response, another part. We heard yesterday about the way that the California Water Project is being used. There's a lot of opportunity there to use that to more effectively respond to demand and match supply and demand as it changes with more wind and solar generation. And then we need to, and one of the exciting things that's beginning to happen is we can now use solar to provide the types of services that we need to have essential reliability. We can use it to provide voltage support at the local level. We can use it to make sure that the grid doesn't deviate too much from the required frequency, 60 hertz. And we can use it to, in part, do a lot more load following. If we allow renewables to produce at some, create some headroom for a solar project out there, we can use it for both ramping up energy as well as ramping down, and that can be a very valuable service. That's been recently proven by the ISO and one of the solar companies, First Solar and NREL, that solar can provide many of the vital ancillary or essential reliability services. So I'll end my answer to that question here, and maybe we can continue that afterwards.
Yeah, great. And so that kind of leads to the larger geographic level. Todd, maybe you can speak to the extent to which you think federal policy is or has been important to solar energy development in California throughout the country. So what can you share with us about recent developments and maybe if you can crystal ball and look into the future that are occurring at the federal level with regard to the impact, the potential impact of solar development in our region?
Yeah, thanks very much. Great to be here. Yeah, federal policy, just like state policy in California, has played a huge role in the development of the solar and renewable energy market. You know, I just would remind people, so for some of us who've been involved in the industry for a long time, We've reached a point of nirvana where we now see renewable energy and solar very cost competitive, if not cost advantaged, in many markets here in California and around the world. I would just note that solar, renewable energy, no longer fringe or alternative energy. In fact, wind and solar are fully mainstream. Since 2008, more than half of all new power capacity added in the United States has been renewable energy. In the last 4 and 5 years or so, more than 70% of all new capacity added in the United States on the electricity front has been from renewable energy, surpassing all other forms of energy, including coal, gas, nuclear, et cetera. So we're fully in the money and mainstream. I'd note that also renewables have been the largest source of private sector infrastructure investment in the United States. That's according to BlackRock, one of the major asset managers in the world. And so we've seen great progress in our sector as a result of important industry ingenuity combined with some good policy. I would note that the renewable energy and solar policy is a great example of what we call a classic American federalism. It really is a nice example when you have federal government moving the same direction as state government, doing what is appropriate to each, but headed the same direction. And I think in the solar and renewable energy space, we've seen that. And I would also note it's been very important on a bipartisan basis. And we walked through the history of it, you could see this, and if you look below the surface. And I think as Ed was outlining, California has come a long way. There were some of us here involved in the early days of solar development, renewable energy development, participated in the first CEC programs 20 years ago. I remember when we got a $6 million budget at the CEC, courtesy of John Giesman, who was a commissioner at the CEC at the time. We thought that was huge. When he doubled to 12, wow. When we went to 20 million, we're like nirvana. Of course, those are the early days. Then, of course, we saw an important progress with the self-generation program. It's now driving storage, but in the first days of its existence back in 2002, 3 or so, it was a very important driver of solar technology deployment. And then the California Solar Initiative, the Million Solar Roofs, that Arnold Schwarzenegger championed, along with Kevin Murray in the state Senate, a great example of bipartisan support. And I would say it was that program that took solar to a whole different level here, not only in California, in the US and around the world. And that was a huge signal for governments across the planet to get more involved in solar. And it's helped drive I think on the federal policy side as well. The federal example to complement this important state demand driver kind of work is really, we've seen it in the tax code. The tax credits that have been available for many, many years now that have helped drive investment and deployment to California and elsewhere around the country. So it's a combination of that good federal tax policy that helps lower the cost for state policies. And we've seen that really drive nicely here in California, and I think even in this area of the world here in Riverside. That has been very important, has really evolved. I would just note, it's a great story to talk about here, but the bipartisan support, the support we've seen for federal policy has really been truly bipartisan back in Washington. It's not always obvious. It's not, if you look below the surface, nothing gets done in Washington unless it has bipartisan support most of the time. There are some examples even on the tax bill last year. But anyway, that's been very important. I would note that the author of the production tax credit for wind, which has been a major driver of wind development in the Midwest and elsewhere, the author of that is Charles Grassley, a Republican from Iowa. He's now chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. There's been important major champions on the ITC as well for solar on the Republican side. So that's been very key, along with what's been happening at the state level to drive the market. I think there's where we're at today, I think is really important. The neat thing about this conference today and even yesterday is about how we're looking forward and how we've seen the issues, the challenges, the opportunities evolve. In Washington, the tax credits are right now on the way to either ramp down or phase out for renewable energy. The wind tax credit actually expires at the end of this year. They do have some good implementing language that allows you to begin construction this year, and then you have 4 years to complete. That's actually will have an important impact to continue some market growth. On the ITC for solar starts ramping down at the end of this year. It goes to 26 from 30% this year to 26% next year, 22% after that, and then zeroes out for homeowners. But we do have a 10% commercial tax credit that will continue. There are some good, again, commence construction rules that will extend the life of this a bit. The reason why I mention this, these tax credits have been important. They continue to be important. But at the time our renewable energy incentives are ramping down, these incentives for oil, gas, nuclear, coal, the conventional technologies, they're permanent. They continue on. They're permanent in the law. There's a real inequity here. When we did the 2015 deal in Congress, when Senator Reid from Nevada helped in the Senate, but we had key Republicans both in the Senate and House do a multi-year extension for the ITC and PTC that we're living with now. The assumption was when Congress got to tax reform, they would also ramp down and phase out the incentives, tax incentives for the conventional energy industries. They didn't do that. As you saw last year, it was a purely partisan play. Republicans did it to move forward on tax bill. There was not a single Democrat in the House or Senate that supported what was done. There's a lot of mixed views about that because perhaps there would have been an opportunity to negotiate some good bipartisanship, including in our area. I would say, however, there's a question about what we do on these tax credits going forward. I would just note that with the House being retaken by the Democrats, we've seen some very important movement. We'll see how this all plays out. But I would just note first, Senator Schumer, the ranking Democrat in the Senate, has proposed a permanent extension of the ITC and PTC. He did that in an important letter end of last year. The House Democrats are right now working on ideas to advance the Green New Deal, laying the foundation for climate legislation that will include a tax element, even as part of infrastructure as well. And they're talking about continuing the incentives for solar and wind. What the shape that takes is a little unclear. We may not be able to get an ITC or PTC. There is talk about moving to a technology neutral incentive that would apply to all energy resources. But of course, the important qualifier would be the impact on emissions reductions for greenhouse gases. Senator Wyden, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee, is expected to introduce a technology neutral tax bill at any day. He was supposed to do it Tuesday. It's been delayed. We've seen this before, but it's likely to come out soon. So very important discussion on the future of these incentives. It will take bipartisan support to get them done. I think that will be there. The other issue I wanted to touch on, and we've talked a lot about storage. Right now, storage does not have tax credit except when it's combined with a solar system and where the storage battery is charged at a minimum of 70% from solar. There is bipartisan support for a storage tax credit, which can really expedite market deployment there. We're going to get a bill introduced soon by Senator Heinrich from New Mexico, a Democrat, coupled with Senator Cory Gardner, a Republican from Colorado. Just note, Gardner is in leadership. So this is an important development that also can help move the ball forward, for the technologies that we're talking about, of course, and also the grid solutions that we need as we see increasing amounts of renewable energy. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more to talk about, on these federal policies as well as and how they have combined on the state side, and to provide a lot of more color on what we're likely to see as these discussions on the policy transpire over the next months and years. But we'll stop there for now and look forward to continued discussion.
Yeah, no, good response and good background for both the state and federal level. And it just strikes me that it seems clear that the administration might have a different idea of energy dependence than might have occurred in prior years. And so with that in mind, and you see sort of a ratcheting back of incentives for the clean fuels industry, electricity, renewable energy, solar, renewable natural gas, and yet, as you mentioned, you're seeing incentives staying in place for the traditional fuels. This is a question for any of you or all of you. To what extent do those incentives, can this clean fuel industry stand on its own, and does it have enough momentum to survive a situation where the very thing that you just described is occurring, incentives for one side, incentives not for the other? And to what extent do you think that might impact our ability at the state level to achieve our 100% goals pursuant to new legislation?
Want to take a cut?
So I agree with what Todd said. Probably the most important thing that the federal government could do is to extend the investment and production tax credits. Could we withstand competing without those? Yes, I think there would be continued deployment of wind and solar, but would it proceed at the pace that's necessary given the urgency of the crisis that we're facing with disruptive climate change? And I think the answer to that is no. So of all the federal policies, the ITC, PTC are the most important. I think beyond that, a infrastructure initiative that increased transmission capacity across the country so that the resource-rich areas like San Bernardino and Riverside counties can not only meet the local needs, but can be used to meet the regional and national needs. But in order to do that, there's going to be a need for investment in transmission, and that's where the federal government through FERC and through Congress and the Department of Energy can be very supportive in expanding transmission.
Yeah, I'd add a little bit more of that as well, because I think this is an area of infrastructure and also especially transmission development and other elements of energy infrastructures where we actually have some high-level bipartisan agreement back in Washington. Now that's high level. It breaks down quickly when you look, go just a little off of that. The president has even called for infrastructure investment. Congress has as well. There is a efforts are moving forward. I understand that Secretary of Transportation Chow just had breakfast recently with the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, a key Republican meeting with a key Democrat to talk infrastructure. This is the first set of conversations we've seen on this, despite public statements. So this is, I think, an important signal. We'll see where that goes. There is, again, broad agreement on that. How to pay for it is where you have a big divide. So, this is something to watch as we go forward. On the transmission piece in particular, though, I think this is where we have a significant area of opportunity to move forward. I think on the legislative front, it will be a priority, but even on the front of FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which governs our wholesale power markets, it's a Trump commission right now, but there is pretty much unanimous support for driving transmission investment, the kind that Ed was referring to. The high voltage, long range transmission lines to take the renewable energy resources like here from the desert Southwest, to the market, mostly California, in California and outside California. And then the Midwest, where you have an enormous resource of wind development, but not the people, right? Farmers are making money at wind. That's just changing the politics of renewable energy. It has fundamentally in the Midwest. Iowa is going to 100% wind powered over the next couple of years. Kansas is at 39% wind powered. Oklahoma 26%. Texas 16%. And these are massive numbers of generation that are taking place in a lot of these places. But we do need the high voltage lines, transmission lines, to get the resource from the Midwest to the load, whether it's further west or east. I would just note, and I think this is important to recall, the FERC, which, like I mentioned, has been reconstituted in the last year. It sat idle. It didn't have a quorum of commissioners, and now it does. There was a unanimous vote about this time last year by the Trump Commission to defeat the Trump proposal to bail out coal and nuclear generation. Remember the administration, President Trump, he won largely on support of coal country. I think there's something from a political standpoint he feels he owes to those people, but he tried to intervene in the market in a way where he engendered bipartisan opposition, Democrats and Republicans alike, because he was going to skew the existing competitive markets for power. And that's not the way to kind of go out there and help coal and nuclear, even if you wanted to. But the FERC, with 3 Trump appointees, defeated that proposal 5-0. I would note that the chairman of the FERC now worked for Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, senator from Kentucky, coal country. But it's below the surface. We have had bipartisan support for renewable energy. I remember a meeting with Neil Chatterjee, he's now the chair of FERC, when he worked for Mitch McConnell on the 2015 tax bill. Actually, he played an important role of getting that deal done, and he was going to help expedite, make sure it happened. So I think there's an understanding there that renewables are an important part of our power mix. There are serious players in the market, serious billions of dollars being invested. It's a serious part of our power future, and they recognize that. And FERC has reflected that. So not only did they defeat the attempt to bail out coal and nuclear, not the smartest approach to do that if they wanted to help, but we've also seen FERC since drive forward with an important Order 841 to help storage, to increase storage capacity in our power markets that complement the nice notion of a tax credit, complement what's going on here in California and some of the other states. So that's important. It requires all the power markets to submit proposals on how they're going to integrate storage and accord value with pricing to help drive storage. They've also worked on the interconnection to facilitate more interconnection of solar and wind across the country. So these are very important developments in the wholesale power markets at FERC coming out of Washington that are going to have very important impact, and on transmission, very important impact of the whole country, very much in this area of the world too, as we work to harness this great solar resource in the region.
Great. And is there any truth to the rumor that those 3 Trump appointees have been missing since they took the vote? Completely unaccounted for?
Well, they haven't been missing. It's a funny line there, but Neil Chatterjee, who's the chair, keynoted our Ref Wall Street Finance Conference in June in New York, where he came to talk about his support for the growing role of renewables. He talked about making sure we continue with competitive power markets, that we hold back interventions in the market that would disrupt competition. These are messages that ring very well in our industry. I would note that he mentioned that in Kentucky, where he's from and where, of course, his former boss is from and represents, that the largest employer in Kentucky now is Amazon. And Amazon has a sizable solar array on their big facility in Kentucky. He actually visited it. So I think these are these indications of how the landscape is changing on our power side, and I think impacting some of the conventional wisdom on how the politics aligns around this stuff. So, and I would just note, and I can go on forever, and I try not to, but the newest commissioner is a guy named Bernard McNamee. He was at DOE when the administration was drafting the coal nuclear bailout. It's interesting that very few people are claiming that they were involved with that, but he was there. But he has gone out of his way in a couple of private conversations I've had with him to talk about how he was involved in renewable energy project development in Virginia and elsewhere, and we do hear him talk about the importance of competition in the markets as well. Those are, again, important signals. He wasn't there last year for that 5-0 vote, so he's there's some important dynamics. The former chair, Kevin McIntyre, appointed by President Trump, passed away in December. But we've seen a very important constructive support for markets, even from the commissioners, and we expect that to continue going forward.
Thanks. Bambi, when we talk about solar, solar will be successful when it's available to everyone. No matter what their income stream is and things like that. So, I think largely, at least the perception is that currently, although solar is growing and becoming more successful, it still is available to not all segments of the society. And this is really where you come in with grid alternatives. And so the question for you is, if our goal is ultimately to have solar not only utilized in increasing amounts, but by all segments of our society, what do you see as the role, or how can low-income, disadvantaged, underrepresented communities participate and be part of the solar economy?
Great, thanks, Rick. Before I directly answer your question, I'm going to actually ask everyone, as you feel comfortable, to close your eyes for a moment. Because what I want to do is put some faces to what we're talking about in our community. We've been talking a lot about technology, about transmission lines, about NEM and ITCs, and a lot of acronyms, but really it is about our community. And our goal is to create prosperous communities with folks, families that are thriving. And so, some of these families could be Pat Brown, who is a family that we served in San Bernardino. She's a longtime community leader and volunteer who really struggled with her high utility bills. We heard, on average 300 plus per month in the summer months, and trying to support a daughter who's trying to go to college. We're also talking about Mr. Rankin, a veteran, retiree, who's battling with medical conditions. And so having to maintain his home at a constant temperature, a comfortable temperature, in order to live a quality of life. We're also talking about the Ramirez family, a young family with 5 kids, struggling to make ends meet and trying to really build a future for their kids. We're also talking about a transforming workforce. A young woman named Yaslin, who graduated from college and wanted to really help in the community and work in the front lines to transform our communities in renewable energy, as well as bring social and environmental justice. And a person named Rex, who's also in this audience right now. He might be smiling. You can see him when we open our eyes. But a longtime renewable energy advocate who, about 10 years ago, was trying to figure out, how do I get into this industry? What does it take to get into this industry, and how can I retool my career to be part of this industry? Those are the different faces and people that we are trying to make a difference and bring into and make sure is a part of our growing solar economy. So feel free to open up your eyes. But as we picture this growing economy for renewable energy and solar and meeting our different mandates, there is and continues to be a challenge to make sure that it is an inclusive movement and an equitable movement, to make sure that underserved communities and disadvantaged communities are considered. Some of the challenges we face are really related to access. And access, I kind of see it as there's 3 prongs to access. One is knowledge, just knowing that this technology and the benefits of this technology exist is important. And in the frontline communities, there's oftentimes lack of knowledge, or sometimes misinformation, that makes it even more difficult to bring information to the community. There's different language barriers and cultural practices in communities that we need to consider as well when we're working in our frontline communities. There's also technological, so the technology itself, just understanding that and making it affordable for our communities. While the investment tax credit and other financial incentives have been able to bring down the cost, it's still a far reach for some of the families that we serve in our organization. And lastly, the third prong I see in terms of access is our workforce. Making sure that there is a sustaining workforce for the solar economy. And oftentimes, there's a large portion of the workforce that is in there installing solar, selling solar, designing solar. So we want to make sure that these opportunities are also made available for our communities, training folks up, starting in the elementary schools, with just the knowledge and the awareness, and really providing vocational skills as they go through their schooling. And when they graduate, having skills that can take them right into the solar industry if they desire, or into higher education. Challenges, though, continues. I mentioned about the information and lack of awareness. There are other things that other speakers have mentioned that is a threat to working in disadvantaged communities, and one of them is the investment tax credit and the phasing out of that. Because as an organization, we actually depend on that financing mechanism to be able to bring the projects to our communities. And if it steps down, it's going to make it even harder to be able to bring the access to the communities that we serve. Other speakers have mentioned about the changing net metering and rate structures, the time of use that's going to kick in tomorrow. So for a family that might have gone in solar system, maybe today they are generally saving about 75% on their bills. Tomorrow, it might just automatically go down to 30%. That's significant for the families that we serve because every single penny counts and matters. And we don't want families to be making hard choices between medicine for their kids or shoes or paying their power bills. So those are some of the challenges that we face in the work that we do here in the Inland Empire, but also throughout California and the nation.
Great. This next question I think is a good one for all of you. I mean, solar is becoming more popular. It's becoming more mainstream. It's becoming less expensive overall. Still a ways to go on that. But now we're starting to see advances in solar storage as well, solar storage technologies, and that could be an additional kind of game changer as far as ratcheting up the implementation of solar over time. So, all of you, what do you think this means for the future of solar? How are utilities like Edison adapting to more and more households and businesses installing solar and storage behind the meter? And I guess overall, the question I would have for you is answer the question, storage will be a common and affordable component of this whole household solar package in how many years? How long is it going to take to get there?
Well, let me start with why it's so important for us to advance the implementation of storage, because what Scott Murdishaw said earlier, storage and solar and demand response can provide really vital grid services and can avoid utilities having to make investments in upgrading or putting in new wires and transformers and other equipment. So we really need to think of storage as a resource that has multiple uses. Storage can provide value for the customer behind the meter by giving them some increased resiliency if it's structured in a way where it can operate in an islanded configuration. It can also provide for commercial customers. It can reduce the peak demand, which is typically a component of the rate structure for commercial customers. But it more importantly can provide both capacity and energy into wholesale markets, as well as providing relief for congestion or for overloading specific local conditions. And it's in that area where we really need to get more precise and a better understanding and put the policies in place so that we capture the value that storage together with the other technologies can provide to the grid. So how long is it going to take? So there's sort of a rule of thumb that every time you double the technology, you reduce the cost by 20%. We've seen that for a number of technologies like solar. So it is a combination of demand pull and cost reduction. But creating the right markets and creating the right set of incentives is going to be really important to making this transition and taking a little bit of the burden off of these changes in time of use rates and possible changes to net energy metering that are coming up.
I would add that storage is a critical technology in terms of the overall ecosystem of energy efficiency and renewable energy package. I would add to that also, it's PV energy efficiency, storage, EV, all that together is something that we're, as an organization, trying to figure out how do we bring that package of technologies to our communities with an ever kind of changing infrastructure. So that's one of the challenges that we're facing and trying to figure out. And right now storage is prohibitive for our communities that we serve. So how do we bring that down? We don't want to necessarily experiment in our communities. That really does a disservice to our communities. So how can we really figure out and support the market adoption as quickly as possible so we can bring down the cost of storage and other technologies to make it more accessible in the communities?
And I would just add that storage really is really key, especially as I think we all understand in this room, as we scale up, as we figure out how to integrate more and more renewables in our grid. It's going to be very important for storage and other approaches to help deal with the variability. There are other things that are going to be done also to complement that. And the good news again is, and I just reiterate, is that there's very significant bipartisan support for storage incentives back in Washington. We even have had recent conversations with Speaker Pelosi's office. House Democrats are going to be moving forward with a tax package to advance clean energy infrastructure investments as part of both an effort to improve infrastructure as well as address climate. Storage will figure prominently there. There's a chance that we may get a tax extenders package. We almost had a deal a couple weeks ago to move a tax extenders package that could have included a storage tax credit. So that we're expected to have a couple of more bites at that apple this year. So that there may be a real opportunity to advance storage. So I think as our friends at Edison laid out very clearly, there's already a lot of storage that is being invested in. We're seeing the military deploy storage to support their needs. We're seeing corporate use of it. I think of the companies like Amazon and Google who have heavy load, energy load data centers. They increasingly require 24/7 critical needs, and they're including storage in some of their investments to make sure they have that power. So I think this market's going to evolve. Hopefully the policy catches up with the technology development to help accelerate the market. Doesn't always work on the same time synced up, the same timeline as we'd like, but I think there is a significant support for moving storage as we look at advancing the grid for the future.
Yeah, sort of staying on this theme of how we can continue to help the region increase the provision of solar to the greater community. I kind of wanted to go back to you, Bambi, and low-income households and individuals. What kind of policies or guiding principles, policy tools do you see might be necessary to be enacted by local governments, regional agencies, state agencies that would continue to move that needle forward so that we can have solar available to all facets of our communities?
In terms of guiding principles, there's really, from our organization, 5 guiding principles for solar policies that try to address and bring access to low-income communities and disadvantaged communities. The first one that I spoke to about earlier is access and affordability. We want to make sure that the policies bring significant financial benefits to the communities and deep cost savings so that the communities and the families can overcome the financial challenges that they have with rising utility cost. Another guiding principle is community engagement. It's really important as we develop policies and programs to make sure that the community is involved here. If we're trying to build a movement and we're trying to have a shift, then the entire community needs to be a part of that. I would love to see, for example, this conference next year filled with more community members, because we need to be a part of that. We need more voices in order to make sure that the policies and the programs that we create are inclusive and consider different perspectives. The third guiding principle is consumer protection. We have seen, I think Stephen showed us some slides this morning of homes with solar panels that are in the shade. I've seen plenty of solar panels driving around here just in Riverside in San Bernardino that are located on the north-facing slope of a roof. Someone did not explain to our homeowners about solar and the benefits of solar. And with the lack of education or awareness, a homeowner wouldn't No, I mean, it's like you can have a salesperson going in and say, we can maximize solar on your roof. They never said on the north side. So consumer protection is really critical to make sure that families are really getting the cost savings and really getting the benefits from the technology that we intend it to be. We're also looking at another guiding principle for sustainability, so that low-income programs has to encourage long-term market development, because that's going to drive, again, availability of technologies and services, as well as bring down the cost of the technologies and services. And lastly, the fifth principle that we have is compatibility and integration. So integration into existing programs, so they're not standalone and confusing for families to access, so that energy efficiency, energy conservation, and water efficiency are all combined and wrapped with renewable energy, storage, electric vehicles, etc. Some of the policy tools that we've talked about, we've talked about the ITC, net metering. One of the ones that I'm really excited about is the new community solar program that's being deployed. And it's in pilot stage right now, but it's an opportunity really for our communities to be able to develop local sited projects and have subscribers to it. So no matter if you own a home or if you're a renter, but you can subscribe to the benefits of that technology. And so I think over the next few years, as we see some pilot projects being deployed, it'd be really exciting to see how community solar can then be deployed throughout our various communities here, bringing access closer and maybe taking some of those peaker power plants offline so that we can have cleaner air here in the Inland Empire.
Great. Ed, I want to kind of come back to you. Can you speak a little bit about the CPUC? CPUC every 2 years or so puts together a statewide integrated resource plan. I think the most recent plan was done in 2017, 2018, and basically the plan lays out what the needs are over the course of the next decade or so through the year 2030. Can you talk a little bit about how the CPUC puts the plan together, and what resources, at least it expects and are in the plan, expected to be built over the course of the next decade or so?
Yeah, let me answer that question in the context of the formation and the growth of community choice aggregators in California, because I think these two issues, how do you plan, how do you procure, what's the role of these local load-serving entities, community choice aggregators. Community choice aggregators are fairly new. The law was set up in 2002. I was actually with the city of San Francisco when we pushed that. But it's really gained momentum. The first big community choice aggregator was Marin Clean Energy. But now we have, I think, 19 or 20 operating, new ones forming, like the one here in Riverside County. So the purpose of integrated resource planning, typically they had been done by large utilities, Southern California Edison, because they had responsibility for planning for generation, transmission, distribution, energy efficiency, et cetera. But that's now changing. We have in California over 50 entities that have some responsibility for serving customers. Community choice aggregators will be out there assembling portfolios of resources and that are needed to maintain reliability within their area, as well as decarbonize the grid and keep the rates affordable. So the Commission's responsibility now is not just to approve individual plans, but to piece together a comprehensive statewide plan that represents the desires and preferences of multiple load-serving entities. And that's really quite a challenge, because they may not overlap. Of course, these load-serving entities don't follow exactly the way the grid is configured. And so, well, I should mention one other thing. The integrated resource plan that the state's putting together is driven primarily by one key metric, and that is decarbonization. It needs to maintain reliability. But the Commission has set a goal to hit a target for the electric system of reducing carbon emissions to a certain level by 2030. It's 42 million metric tons. Southern California Edison says we can do better than that. We could drive it down even more to 28 million metric tons, which is a really remarkable reduction in carbon emissions from the electric sector. But to do that, we need to have a coordinated strategy across the state. So that's going to be the challenge for a lot of these CCAs, is how do they actually get the best fit set of resources? And there may be a need for the formation of sort of coalitions or aggregations of CCAs, kind of like, you know, the city of Riverside is part of the Southern California Public Power Association, and SCAPA actually acts on behalf of Riverside in doing procurement. There may need to be something like that for CCAs. It's going to be a complicated issue to you know, get the best fit of resources. CCAs have the additional challenge in that they're fairly new organizations. They're going up a learning curve. They don't yet, in many cases, have, you know, they're new. They don't have a credit rating. They don't have a credit history. So to be able to transact financially, the counterparty is going to need to rely on the credit. So these are sort of big issues that are coming forward. As we're going to drive to 100%, we're going to have to figure out how to deal with these issues. I know the legislature is sort of keeping an eye on this and looking to both the PUC on how well they do this job of putting together an integrated resource plan. We're finishing the first one. It projects by 2030 we'll need about 10,000 megawatts of new renewable energy to hit 50% RPS, Renewable Portfolio Standard. The preferences are about 6,800 of that is solar, and the rest is wind. We probably need to have 1,000 to 2,000 megawatts of energy storage for our battery storage to also to meet the needs. So the needs are enormous. The amount of investment that will go into it are enormous. We just need to make sure that we proceed in a way where these resources get developed and built.
Yeah, good. As one who's involved in community choice aggregation and moving forward with our entity, which is called Western Community Energy, might want to talk with you further about your ideas on that. Final question, and then I don't know if we're going to have any time for questions for the audience. So it seems like the goal of this conference, you know, and the education here is we really are striving to see if we can make inland Southern California the nation's leader in rooftop solar installations. And so if that's sort of our overarching goal, I'll ask the question of all of you. What do you think are the most important things that need to occur, or if they're in existence, continue to move forward in order to achieve that goal? And then conversely, what barriers exist or potential barriers might be coming up that might preclude our ability to achieve that long-term, short and long-term objectives?
Well, I think as I think we've illuminated during this conference and elsewhere, that this area of California is just really rich in the solar resource, and there's a lot of existing infrastructure here when you think about rooftops. So there's much more that can be done there. There's been a major movement in the corporate world to procure more solar and renewable energy. Big box retailers have a good rooftop space and are interested in power as well. So I think that's an opportunity to continue to develop. And of course, you're bordering here the deserts, where you have a very rich solar resource, that could help generate utility scale solar at a much higher level. So I think the opportunity is here, but as we're illuminating in the conference, there's some very important siting and permitting improvements that can be made to help accelerate and facilitate. Even on the residential side, as we learned from Sunrun, there's, as we've talked here on, there's some, I think the issue is not about solar or wind. The technology works really well. Solar is proven, wind is proven. It's integration at scale. How do we integrate these? Friends in the utility community have that big challenge to figure out how we address the duck curve and how we integrate variables at scale to with the other existing resources. So I think those are the challenges. We also need transmission. We got to get the power where it's generated, oftentimes sometimes in remote areas to load. I think we touched on all of that. So there's still a lot of work to do to take advantage of the very important cost reductions we've seen in solar and wind to really drive them at scale. The good news is that these technologies are cost advantaged. The goal of 100% set by the state, 60% renewable by 2030 is attainable for sure. And I think even on a national basis, there's a whole lot more we can do. So, we have to get at these issues. They're different than they were before, but very important. So the work is ongoing. But the reward is significant in investment and business and jobs opportunities, as well as great benefit for our local and global climates.
I would add that community buy-in and engagement is a critical piece in our work here in inland Southern California. As consumers and as part of the workforce, we need to make sure that we engage our entire community in this movement. Continued incentive is going to be key to be able to continue bring access and affordability to technologies in the communities. And the third piece I see is coordination and integration of technologies, infrastructure, and streamlining of some of these systems and processes that we have, from the permitting process, siting, et cetera, inspections. All those are key pieces in terms of being able to deploy it in our frontline communities.
So when I flew into the Ontario airport a couple days ago, I was reminded by the major amount of commercial rooftop space here, since the area really is a center for wholesale distribution, and there's a real opportunity to leverage that resource to develop a lot of solar. Back in 2008, Southern California Edison was going to put up about 250 megawatts on roofs, lease the space from the owner of the building, and then put the solar system in and export it back to the grid. These roofs really aren't appropriate for net metering because the loads are pretty small in the warehouse, but the space on the roof, there's actually one project out in Paris that has 10 megawatts on the roof. The amount is enormous, and what it really represents here for the community is an opportunity to develop local workforce this is a resource that can be built up over time. People who live fairly near where it is, not having to go as far out in the desert to work on projects. So that's sort of the one kind of concrete thing I'd like to say. There needs to be a way to figure out how to leverage this big resource regionally to do a lot of solar, and also to create value for the distribution grid.